Greetings, everyone. Dale Parrish, COS today, along with Mr. Ken Kashuba, our state communications coordinator and co-host this evening. How you doing, Ken?
I'm doing good, Dale. How about yourself?
Good, good. Is it warm down your way? it's
Well,
not up here.
yeah, but we got a whole lot more snow than you, and it's usually the reverse of that, you know?
Oh, is that right? Yeah, you did get
Get all
more.
the snow, and we just we miss it and get cold weather, but I don't
Well,
know.
it's
But
cold up here, and it's supposed to get colder.
they're saying tomorrow night we're supposed to get the first negatives of the year.
Yeah. Well, folks, for the viewers, Ken and I are located in Indiana, and I'm north of Ken, so it's a little tad bit colder up my way. But anyway, folks, we got a lot to get to tonight. We have a great show lined up for you this evening. But Ken, why don't you start us off and tell us about that QR code up there?
That QR code is there for people to take their smartphones out and take a snapshot of that, which will allow you to become a supporter. Supporter/subscriber, because what you'll get with that is entrance into our platform, whereby we offer a lot of things that you can't get elsewhere. Video series. A lot of our contributors have their material there, and you can go back and look at things they've done way back when, and some other freebies, some connections to some great websites and what have you. So all free. We don't ask for any money. We're not hanging out the donation shingle. We're just looking for the support. So if you would just go ahead and click that QR code, and I will put a URL in the chat in case you don't have your smartphone, so you can still subscribe. But that's what you get, and we look forward to increasing our subscribe numbers.
All right. Good deal. Thanks, Ken.
Mm-hmm.
Ken, we've kind of gotten away from doing this, but I'm going to flash this up real quick. This is episode 280, and you've been on board for 139 episodes. I'll tell you,
Yeah.
we're rocking up. We're closing in on that 300 mark, aren't we?
Yeah, you've lost hair and I've gotten grayer, so I guess it's starting to come along.
Well, I don't think I had any to lose, but if you okay, well, listen, let's get started. Gary Harbaugh, who does our debt avalanche series, I asked, we've been hearing about the debt ceiling. We've been hearing about that in the news and talking about Trump's been talking about that, of course, and that was an issue with this last continuing resolution and blah, blah, blah. So I've asked Gary, who, like I said, who does the debt avalanche series, I've asked him to record some comments on what is the debt ceiling. So I'm going to bring him on here, and let's listen to what he has to say, Ken.
Sounds good.
Hi, it's Gary with a little discussion, a quick shot about the debt ceiling. You may know, you've heard lately, the debt ceiling is back in place, and something Congress is going to have to deal with. Let's wind the clock way back 100 years ago. Why we have a debt ceiling is because 100 years ago, the United States agreed to get involved in the First World War, and they had to borrow money to provide for the troops, training, equipping the troops. There were fiscal conservatives, both Democrat and Republican, who said, hey, we don't want this to be just a wide open thing. And so we're going to put a limit on the amount of debt that the government can incur so that we don't get involved in this unlimited spending for World War I. Well, World War I came to an end, and they've raised the debt ceiling over and over and over again for more than 100 years. And it's just a game that they play in Washington. So last summer, in June, before Biden dropped out, they suspended the debt ceiling. This is not, they didn't raise the debt ceiling, they suspended it until December 31st of 2024, which everybody understood. That's after the election. It's going to be a new Congress, potentially a new president. Biden was still a candidate at that point in time. and everybody understood something will change because of the election. And the debt ceiling is now not a limit on spending. It is a political weapon that the parties alternatively point at each other. And the party that's not in power can point it at the party in power and say, we won't let you raise the debt ceiling unless you give us some concessions. So it's nothing more than a game they play in Washington. And it hides the fundamental reality that the reason we have debt is because year after year, decade after decade, Congress allocates more money to be spent. They vote for more spending than tax revenue that's going to come in. They know how much tax revenue is going to come in, ballpark anyway. They vote for more spending than what the tax revenue is. That's why there's a debt. And this again points to the fundamental reality that Congress will never limit its own spending because that's how they buy votes. That's how they pretend like they represent us, by giving us money that they take from us and borrow. And so this is why we need a convention of states to put limits on federal spending. Congress doesn't want to do that because they like to play this game, pretend like they're responsible adults when we all know they're not. And so I think President Trump is correct. We should simply get rid of the debt ceiling, stop playing this game, and start dealing with the reality that there is no limit on spending. And Congress has to face the reality that they are the problem, and they need to fix it. And they won't fix it, so we, the people, have to fix it with a convention of states. That's how I see it, and that's where we are today.
Right on. He hit the nail on the head.
Right on. That's right. He's so right. The DC is not going to fix this. They're not going to fix this. We're
Yeah. And as he said, they don't want to recognize that they are the problem.
And now Gary is also going to keep us. He's going to follow the Doge issue, the Department of Government Efficiency. He's going to follow that for us too, and as we go into the Trump administration and see what kind of impact that might have. But I mean, my goodness, you know, a lot of people throughout the years have pointed out the waste in spending in our government. You remember one of Convention of States' foremost supporter, Senator Tom Coburn, the late Senator Tom Coburn. I mean, I think he published a book every year on wasteful spending.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting to see how this all develops. But I thought it was interesting. I wanted to learn some more about the debt ceiling. So,
and I think some of the things going on, Dale, as you and I both know, some of the catastrophes that are going on, these are starting to expose the amount of waste and mismanagement of taxpayer money. And it's only becoming more glaringly obvious that people that are in charge first of all, they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
But I think in some situations there's an actual agenda behind some of them. So.
Yeah, gotta be. Well, listen, let's move on. What we have for you now, folks, is Ken was able to download a recording of a Mark Meckler. He's our leader for Convention of States. An interview with Mark that was done by a Breitbart news commentator. What do you recall the name of the gentleman from Breitbart?
Yeah, that's Mike Staley.
Mike Staley.
Yeah, I might be pronouncing his last name wrong, but Mike is a host of Breitbart Daily News.
Okay, Breitbart Daily News.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, again, Mark does a fantastic job of laying out what Convention of States is all about. But I think the unique thing of this interview is the interviewer seem to really not know much about convention of states. So I think he was very much enlightened, and you'll be able to determine that in a lot of the way he asks his questions and conducts the interview. So let's get started on this, and hope you enjoy this. It's all audio, so hopefully this turns out okay for us here, Ken. So here we go.
But let's switch gears here for a moment and talk about the Convention of States. We are at a real potential massive turning point in our country for good. And we may be at such a point where we need really big structural massive changes. And there's been this movement of this Convention of States, which admittedly, Mark, was something I did not think would ever happen. It seemed like a stretch. But when I see California repealing their Convention of States desire, and like Newsom thinks it's a possibility. So I think we better all get on the bandwagon if we're not already there. Mark Meckler is here. He's the president and co-founder of Convention of States Action. Mark, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Good to be with you this morning.
Thanks for taking time. So lay it on us. Give us the elevator pitch. What is the Convention of States?
Yeah, so look, all of us are frustrated with the size and scope of the federal government. We've got DOGE going on soon. Hopefully we hope to get some cuts out of that. But really what we have is a massive structural problem created over the last 115 years where government has grown way outside of the constitutional box. And the fix for that is structural. It's not going to be found in Washington, D.C. It's going to be found in the people doing things like imposing term limits. We hear Donald Trump talking about term limits. Congress will never impose a term limits amendment on itself. It takes 2/3 of both houses. They're not going to do it. We need a balanced budget amendment. We need to force the federal government to stop spending so much money. They could do it temporarily, maybe under the Trump administration, but if we want it permanently, we need a balanced budget amendment. Congress will never do that to itself. They're talking about getting rid of the Department of Education. If they do that, the next time there's a Democrat administration, they can, boom, snap their fingers, open it right back up. We can fix that, all this stuff permanently by having the states come together. There's a provision under Article 5 of the Constitution. 2/3 of the states can request to come together, debate amendments, propose those amendments, and send them out for ratification to the states so that we get this stuff in the Constitution. No Department of Education, no Department of Energy, term limits on Congress and staff and bureaucrats like no Fauci ever again for 40 years. These are things, structural changes that are necessary to fix our country, and only the people have the will to impose them. Congress does not.
Okay, got a lot of questions. Let's start off with, let's kind of jump to the end. You said we need 2/3 of the states, so we need 34 states to pass this particular resolution. What are you at right now?
19 out of 34, so we're well beyond the halfway point.
Okay. Any states that we think we can still pick up, that we should be able to pick up? Like, I'm looking at your map here, like I see Montana, right? You would think Montana would want to jump on board, for instance. Do we still have a bunch of states that you think we can get to the 34?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like in the coming session, so in January, between January and February, all 50 states will come back into session. Montana looks good. South Dakota looks good. Wyoming looks good. Iowa, Idaho, Ohio. We have a bunch of states where we'll be moving fast this coming year.
16, 17, 18, 19. Sorry, I'm looking at the how many states Trump won. So Trump won 31 states.
Right.
All right, so you'd have to get a little bit above, what he was able to pull off.
Yeah, I think there's 3 states probably that we need to flip back. So in other words, some states, and we're involved in elections all over the country where it's legal to do so. And so, for example, Virginia will have an election in 2025. That will, in my opinion, likely flip. It's very close. It'll likely flip from a blue state to a red state in 2025. Nevada is a flippable state because union membership is moving to the right, even though the unions haven't moved to the right. Nevada has been Republican just a few years back, a few sessions back. So there are states that are flippable, and we and a lot of other people are working to flip those states.
Yes, interesting. And I was just looking at the presidential election results, but that's not it. It's the state houses that matter here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that when you look at the presidential, that gives you a pretty good idea of where we're at. And when you say 31, I think that's about right. I think there are now 30 states with both houses that are Republican in their state legislatures. So we've got to flip a few more states.
Okay. All right. So that's that. Okay. Let's talk about Article 5. Do you mind if I read it? And we can run through the text here. So Article 5 of the Constitution, our founding fathers put this in here. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to the Constitution. Okay. So that's if we want to pass the 15th Amendment or whatever, right? You're saying Congress, the Constitution says that Congress comes together, 2/3 of houses shall deem it appropriate. Okay. Or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4. Okay. So it says either we can do it the way that we've always done it, which is Congress proposes a constitutional amendment and then the states ratify, or the way you're talking about, this convention of states. Is that right? So am I interpreting this right?
Yeah, you nailed it. And the way that got in there is important. 2 days before the end of convention, September 15th, 1787, and one of the delegates, his name is Colonel George Mason from Virginia, he stands up and he tells the guys that are there, we have a problem. We drafted a constitution. We gave the power to Congress to propose amendments, but we didn't give it to the people acting through the states. And he asked a question, are we so naive that we believe that a federal government that becomes a tyranny will propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? Because that was the only thing they had in there. The guys realized that was ridiculous. It was unanimous. There was no debate, literally, and they all agreed, we're going to have to do this. At some point, the federal government's going to get out of control. We're definitely at that point.
Well done, George. Yes, of course. Why would Congress propose limits on its own power? There needs to be another way that the people can impose limits on their power. And that's the Convention of States. Yeah, of course. Okay. Well done, George. Okay. How do we do that? Like, what is the process you're going through to trigger this Convention of States?
So, and this was the intent of the founders, it takes a long time. It takes literally millions of people because you have to build consensus in 34 state legislatures. And this is what the framers wanted. They wanted to make sure that we couldn't do this easily, that you couldn't change the Constitution willy-nilly. And so basically we go out, we build a grassroots army in every single state. We have that. There are over 5 million people involved across the country. We have leadership teams in every state, all volunteers. And what they do is they find a sponsor in the state legislature to sponsor a piece of, it's not actually legislation, it's called a resolution. And then both houses in the state have to pass the same resolution. And the resolution is the same in every state. The resolution basically has these 3 parts. It says that we want to discuss imposing term limits. We want to discuss fiscal restraints on the federal government. We want to discuss scope and jurisdictional restraints on the federal government, meaning like what can they do and what can they not do. For example, one of those is we need to keep them out of education, in my opinion. I think most of America agrees to that. So the process is that resolution gets filed, it gets assigned to a committee, it gets debated in committee. We send grassroots activists into the legislature. They testify. They become experts. And then ultimately it makes its way to the floor of the legislature and hopefully gets passed by the legislature. Uniquely, it doesn't need a governor's signature because it's not legislation. It's a resolution. So it's strictly an action by the legislature of the 34 states.
Okay. So when 34 finally get there, then it triggers and then it happens. But this is something I'm learning as we're chatting here. This is not a revolution per se. It doesn't eliminate the Constitution and we start from scratch. It just proposes amendments to the Constitution. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think this is really important. Some people get confused about this. And there's a terminology that matters here. You'll hear people call this a constitutional convention. It's not, because you're not drafting a constitution.
Yes.
So this is just what's called an Article 5 amending convention, and all they can talk about is what they say they're going to talk about when they pass this resolution, those 3 subjects that I talked about.
Oh, interesting. Okay, because that was one of my concerns too, is let's say we trigger this and we're like in this like MAGA, conservative thing. And then for some reason something happens and like Newsom is the chair of the committee and now like we get rid of the Second Amendment. You're like, well, hold on, wait a second. This isn't what we asked for here. But you're saying it can't do that.
Yeah, that can't happen. Remember, the 34 states who call it have agreed in advance on what they're going to talk about. So essentially this is going to happen with a Republican supermajority.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So sorry, I was, can you go over the three things again? Cause you're right. Cause this is about, again, this,
would impose term
sorry, let me say one more thing, Mark. Sorry.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I get this right. So because it's not totally getting rid of the whole Constitution, this is just a way to make an amendment. So technically this could be done with just one thing, right? We could have a convention of states that just say one specific thing we want to add to the Constitution.
Yeah, that's correct.
Oh, that's very interesting. Okay, as you were. So what are the three that you've narrowed it down that 19 states have so far passed?
Yep. So first is anything that would impose term limits on D.C. And this is important. People talk about term limits. They think about Congress. I think that's good, but it's not good enough. If you do term limits alone without term limiting staffers and bureaucrats, then the staffers and bureaucrats become the only power in Washington, D.C., because they outlive all the elected officials. So you can limit, according to our resolution, anybody who's elected in D.C. and any federal officials. So I call it the Fauci Amendment. We should never have a Fauci again who's been there for 40 years and accumulates all this massive power. Second is anything that would impose fiscal restraints on D.C. So that's a balanced budget amendment. They'll never stop spending on their own, but it's also tax caps and spending caps. It's also imposing, for example, generally accepted accounting principles on Washington, D.C. These are things that we need to bring our fiscal house in order. And then finally, and most importantly, in my opinion, are what are called scope and jurisdiction restrictions. When the Constitution was drafted, there were 17 enumerated powers for the federal government. Because of the federal courts, there are, I don't know how many, 17 million powers that the federal government has now. And we need to go back and tell them what they cannot do. For example, we should say to them, you may not be involved in education, you may not be involved in energy, you may not be involved in healthcare, you may not be involved in the environment. We should get rid of the EPA, the Energy Department, the Education Department, and push all those things back to the states. The states already do all of those things. They have the capacity, if they want to regulate all of that stuff. That needs to be taken away from the federal government, and that can be debated at this convention.
Okay, very good. So at the convention, so your resolution doesn't specifically say what will happen. It's just like themes that will be discussed and figured out?
That's correct. This is what's called a subject matter resolution.
Okay, so then we get there to this convention, which I hope is in the Philadelphia Independence Hall. Can we make that happen? Can we like retrofit maybe some way to get everyone in there? Like everyone has to wear white wigs to make it. Let's really embody, the spirit of our founder. And then debate it out. And then after they come forward, this committee, and we're like, all right, here's what we're going to vote on. Then the states, then 3/4 of the states have to vote on it?
That's correct. So it takes in convention, and if people want to picture what this will look like, it'll be a lot like a state legislature. Every state will send a delegation. By the way, this is important, they send as many people as they want, but each state gets one vote. New Hampshire has the same amount of votes as California or Texas. And so each state gets a vote, and if they can get 26 states to agree on something, then that amendment becomes a suggestion to the states, and it goes out to the states for ratification. So this is really important, Mike. You hear a lot of people say that this is really scary because who knows what comes out of it, and we don't want to mess with the Constitution. Well, anything that comes out of a convention it's just a suggestion, and then it takes 3/4 of the states or 38 states to ratify it.
Oh, this is so controlled in a good way, right? Because I think, right? I don't know why, but like part of me was like, oh, it's too much, right? It's too wild.
Yeah, that's very common. Yep.
Yeah. No, this is very outlined and orderly, and lots of checks. So you would need more states to ratify the proposals than it takes to call for the convention in the first place, right? So you need 34 to call for the convention, correct, but 37 to ratify?
38 to ratify.
Yes, it rounds up. Okay, so you would need a couple of those, like, let's call them blue states, in order to be like, oh, you know what, actually, that's a pretty good idea. Let's go ahead and do those things. Wow, that is pretty good. Do you think the Constitution's a living document?
I hate that term, and I don't think it is, because what's meant by that term is that we can interpret it however we want. And I think it's exactly opposite. The Constitution was a contract between the people and the country. And the idea of a contract being a living document is absurd. It's the same as you and me saying, look, I bought a car. I got a 5-year loan on the car. So I have a contract between me and the bank. And 3 years in, I say to the bank, I know that we said my payment was $350, but it's a living contract. My financial situation changed. My payment's now $250.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
That's
it doesn't work that way, and the Constitution is not that way. But you could go to the bank and say, hey, I'm in financial trouble. I'd like to renegotiate this.
Yes.
And that's what this is in a convention of states. What we're attempting to do is renegotiate the bargain that we actually imposed on the federal government by getting the states together and agreeing on a different bargain.
Okay. I got a constitutional question. Like constitutional theory. So the Constitution says, so the states made the Constitution, and the states made the federal government. And the states said, hey, feds that we're creating, you only allowed to do these 17 things. You can't do anything else. And anything that's not listed here, the states retain their power to do these things. And that's evolved over these hundreds of years into something very different. So you're saying this Convention of States, though, we would have to then go back in and explicitly say, hey, we're going to double down. You can't do the things that we said you can't originally do. Or not. What? You're not.
No, I think that's exactly correct. I mean, basically, to joke around about it, I call it the no really convention. Like, no, we actually really meant the stuff that we said in 1787. We didn't expect the courts to manipulate that stuff.
Yes.
Let me give an example of the way they've manipulated it. So, for example, the Department of Education, Thomas Jefferson was asked during his lifetime why we don't spend federal money on education. And he said, well, you can't do that because the Constitution doesn't authorize it.
Yes.
But the courts have said, oh, no, we have this thing called the Commerce Clause, and that authorizes it. They've used the Commerce Clause to authorize almost everything. All these agencies I mentioned, Department of Energy, Education, EPA, all these agencies are authorized under this Commerce Clause, quote-unquote, interpretation. The interpretation is outrageous. It gives the federal government the authority to do almost everything, and that's not what the framers intended. So we need to be explicit and say, no, not these things.
It's really good. I'm a little distracted by the parallels. Not distracted. I'm interested in the parallels with the founders and how some of them didn't think it was necessary to put in the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
Because they're like, well, yeah, of course everyone has a right to a gun. We don't have anywhere in here where it says you don't, like the feds can take away your guns. So why do we have to reiterate you can't? It's all right. And literally they said that, like, well, why do we need to have a First Amendment freedom of speech? Like, obviously the government can't take away your speech. And like a lot of the founders are like, no, we should really be explicit about it. And that kind of sounds like what you're calling to do here again, too. Like, let's be explicit about what we think are obvious things, but apparently aren't.
Yeah, I think you nailed that debate. I mean, what you're talking about is the anti-federalists, and they looked at that Constitution and they said, look, there's not enough protection in here for our freedoms, for the liberties that came from our Creator. We need to be explicit about those things. And they were right. I mean, it turns out history has absolutely vindicated the anti-federalists, and so our job is to do what they wanted to do, and then some, is to tie down the federal government further and put it back in that constitutional box.
Yes, very good. We quoted John Adams, who wrote a letter to Samuel Adams, his second cousin, which I don't randomly. We quoted this earlier today, and Sam Adams wrote him that the love of liberty is interwoven in the soul of man, and John Adams was like, I don't know, I don't think it is actually, and he went on to say this. I got it right here. He said. He basically said that he talked about the wolf, the fable of the wolf, and how the wolf would prefer to be lean and hungry in the woods as opposed to the plump and round dog, domesticated dog. And he says the wolf actually has a love of liberty more than most men. He said the men in all ages have preferred ease, slumber, and good cheer to liberty when they're in competition. He said we must not then depend alone upon the love of liberty in the soul of man for its preservation. Some political institutions must be prepared to assist this love against its enemies. Interesting. Yeah.
Man, you just quoted from two of my favorite guys, and who had different perspectives on the Revolution and the Constitution. And I think John Adams was wiser. Sam Adams was the great narrator of the American Revolution, but for wisdom and understanding human nature,
yes,
that was John Adams.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, Sam Adams. Like, I like the people love liberty, and like I love that spirit. Right, that's good. But you need the temperance of like, I don't know. You should make sure that they do by doubling down and saying, hey, feds, you really, really can't do these things. All right, this is great. All right, now the reason I want to have you on is because California, what's California's role in all this?
So California has an actually super interesting position compared to most states and what they've done. Very recently, Gavin Newsom pushed for it, and they passed a call for a convention to repeal the Second Amendment, essentially, to attack gun rights. He wouldn't say repeal, but that's what it was about.
Yeah.
And so they recently passed that call, and then in the following session, they passed a resolution rescinding all of their Article 5 applications, because a lot of states have applications on that have been around for 100 years, 150 years, for different things that aren't even relevant today, general conventions. So California did a rescission of all applications.
So they may have had one on the books from like, hey, women should be allowed to vote or something.
Exactly. Yep. Or a lot of them had for a balanced budget amendment alone or things like that. And so a lot of the blue states, because they see what's happening with our movement, they're afraid of this convention because they know that our intent is to wipe out progressivism. So they fear that. So a lot of the blue states have been going out doing these blanket rescissions where they rescind their applications.
So that's what Newsom did the other day. So his specifically was about getting rid of the second. It was about gun rights that he said.
That's correct.
That alone wouldn't have triggered anything to do with what you guys are doing because they're about different issues.
Exactly.
But just to double be sure, they're like, hey, let's get rid of all of it. Oh, interesting. Very, very good. Okay. I think this is great, Mark. Well done. How long have you been working on this?
I've been working on it 11 years now.
Man, why?
Because I think it's the most important thing we can do to save the country for our kids and grandkids. I just had my first granddaughter. She's 5 months old. I look at her and I think, it's great to have the political fights. I'm glad we're winning. I'm happy about Donald Trump becoming president, but I don't want her fighting about the same things that we're fighting about. I don't want her fighting about whether we balance the budget. I want her fighting about these, forgive my words, but these scumbags that are in Congress for 40 years living on the public dole. I don't want her having those fights. I want to finish this off and be done with this and make the permanent changes that are necessary. They'll have their own political fights 30 years from now. Sure. They shouldn't be having the same fights.
So you chose 11 years ago to really take the slog. Right. Like there's people who went for the short victories, which are needed, right? You got to win in the moment too. But you said, you know what? I'm going to take the long way and really lay this groundwork for the big picture victory that we ultimately need. Wow. That's something.
That's correct. And by the way, right now, I think this is our time. In this incoming administration, we have a whole bunch of people who are Convention of State supporters, including Vice President J.D. Vance. You got Vivek Ramaswamy, Pete Hegseth, Brooke Rollins, who's going to be Ag Secretary, Mike Huckabee, who's going to be Ambassador to Israel. We've got the new incoming press secretary as a supporter of Convention of States. So Trump is surrounded by people who have already endorsed this idea and support this idea. I hope that we'll see the president endorse it sometime probably during the first 6 months of the administration.
Wow. Okay. How can we get involved? How can we help?
Yeah, folks can go to conventionofstates.com. First thing you do is sign the petition so your state legislature knows you're in support. And second thing is click on that Take Action tab and volunteer. And this is the most important, Mike. You're out here every day. You're doing this. You're in the fight. Everybody needs to be in the fight. Folks should be in the fight by going to conventionofstates.com and getting involved.
Conventionofstates.com. Well done, Mark. Very impressed with a long concerted effort that I agree with you. I think has made its moment is now very exciting. Mark Meckler is the man here. Conventionofstates.com. Mark, great to talk to you. I know we'll do it again.
Hey, good morning. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it.
Well, yeah, Dale, and I have to correct his name. It's Mike Slater is his name. He's the host of the Breitbart Daily News.
Okay, Mike Slater. Okay. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed that. I tell you, Mark Meckler I've never heard anyone lay out what we're all about any better than he does. I wish I could do it as well as he does, but
he can do it without taking a drink of water too. That's what amazes me.
Yeah. We do this on every live stream, every broadcast. We're talking about the same thing. This is COS today, and what you just heard from Mark Meckler was you heard our whole advocacy all down to about 25 minutes. So
Well, I think he does a great job of the misconceptions and the myths that have been created about it. And
yeah.
and like the host said, he says, "Wow, this is really controlled. It's got a lot of checks and balances." And yeah, it does.
I learned something new every time I hear Mark talk about this. So anyway, okay, let's move on. I got with Larry Hudson over the weekend, and we put together another segment to meet the founders, where he's talking about George Washington. And now we're still not finished with George Washington, but now we're getting into the Revolutionary War period. So I thought it was very, very interesting. So let's get to that real quick here, and then we'll come back and wind things up for this evening. So here's our next Meet the Founders with Larry Hudson. Welcome, everyone. Dale Parrish, COS Today host. Where we've got another segment here of Meet the Founders with Larry Hudson. And for those of you that may be interested in tracking the numbers here, we're calling this episode 3, but now we're on part 3, segment 1. Larry's picking up here with George Washington entering the Revolutionary War. So we thought this would be a good breaking point. So Larry's got a very good segment prepared for us here, as usual. So I hope you're enjoying this segment. I really, my hat's off to Larry. He's just doing a great job on Meet the Founders here with this George Washington episode, I should say. So let me bring Larry on here, and let's get started. Hi, Larry.
Hello, Dale. How are you?
Good to see you, bud. Good to see you. Larry, I've gone over your outline here, and once again, it just looks very, very thorough. We're of course, continuing with George Washington here. We've covered up through the French and Indian War. We're now looking at moving into the Revolutionary War phase here. So let's get started, and of course I'll chime in with a few questions here, I'm sure, as we go along. But so let's get it started, Larry.
Okay, let's get to it, Dale. I'm ready.
Right.
Well, you remember we left off at the end of the French and Indian War. You mentioned that here in America, anyway, and Washington's part in it. It was a part that you might remember wasn't militarily brilliant or even successful, for that matter. The British, of course, we all know, will ultimately win that war 2 years later, but it comes at a terrible price. And unfortunately, there soon develops an attitude that the American colonists are less than their fellow Englishmen across the Atlantic, than they are just another group of people to be ruled and, best of all, to be taxed. In fact, one historian wrote that a proud and victorious Britain considered, and I'm quoting here, the colony's insistence on the right to consent to the laws that governed them to be obsolete. So the Brits weren't having any of this. They wanted money to get their coffers back to the brim. And remember, too, that I had mentioned, I think, before we left the last time, that Britain had issued what was called a royal proclamation at the end of the French and Indian War. That would have been in 1763. And that prohibited the colonists from settling in the Ohio Territory, basically west of where their territories were at this point in time. And this outraged many of them, outraged Washington, in fact, who had fought and bled really for that very territory in that war. So the proclamation was one of the first grievances, if you will, that put Washington on the path of picking up his sword again.
Okay. Now, you say the proclamation was issued in 1763.
I believe so,
Is that
yes.
what you said?
Uh-huh.
But the Revolutionary War, if I remember correct, doesn't start until 1776. So what happened with Washington during this interim period?
Well, yeah, 1775, 1776. Remember, at the close of the French and Indian War, Washington had resigned his command, and he had quit the service with a sense of utter disappointment, frustrated.
Yeah.
And he returned to Mount Vernon, basically, went back. He married the widowed Martha Dandridge Custis that we have discussed previously. And he settled really into the life of a planter and a gentleman. But he also entered politics, and he was elected a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. And then, unfortunately, tensions between Britain and the colonies continued to escalate during this time. There's going to be about a 12-year period here, and disagreements arose over the authority of Parliament to issue policies, tax policies, generally speaking, like the Tax Act, the Sugar Act, Townsend Acts that became the Intolerable Acts, policies that the colonists never consented to, really. And this led to riots and eventually incidents like the Boston Massacre, which I think was 1770 when that occurred. And there we lost 5 people. And Washington, as you might suspect, he sided against Parliament. His status as one of Virginia's leading citizens, a planter, it automatically made him a leader in the colonies and their patriot movement. And I believe it was in 1774 when the First Continental Congress was formed. He attended that Congress in Philadelphia as a delegate. And then, as we all know, later, I think it was in mid-April of 1775, a year later, blood was spilled at Lexington and Concord. And that marked the outbreak of hostilities, really, between Britain and the American colonies. And these two conflicts really paved the way for Washington to now take up his sword, return to the military, and prepare to fight for his country.
So he wasn't involved in Lexington or Concord. Is that what you're saying? He wasn't involved in those?
No, he wasn't. He wasn't involved at that point in time. He really didn't get involved militarily until the Second Continental Congress, which was in 1775. And the Congress at that point, they officially, I think the word was established, the Continental Army. And Washington had appeared in front of the Congress dressed in a military uniform of his own design, powder blue and white. I have a picture. And this apparently was a signal that he was physically prepared to take up his sword. And Congress, of course, at this point in time, desperately needed a leader. And their decision was apparently guided, I think, by Washington's experience in the French and Indian War, certainly his military bearing. And interestingly, I thought, I read that they felt that as a Virginian, he would be better accepted as the leader and would be more likely, the Southern colonies would be more likely to rally behind him. John Adams, as it turns out, was one of his chief supporters in the Congress, made a long, flattering speech, so flattering that it was reported that Washington got up and left the room out of modesty. But after the vote was taken, Washington was elected as commander-in-chief, but he was very reluctant. In fact, there's a quote that with the utmost sincerity, I do not think myself equal to the command I'm being honored with. So he reluctantly, at least to the gathering there at the Congress, said that he wasn't really prepared to do this, but he would do it. Artemus Ward was elected second in command, and a Charles Lee, who he will deal with later, as we'll see, was placed in third command. And interestingly, Congress, not Washington, chose his primary staff officers upon his taking command.
Really? So this is how he became commander in chief then.
Correct.
Okay.
1775, First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress.
Now, am I correct that the Battle of Bunker Hill was the first major battle of the Revolutionary War? Am I right? Was he in charge of that battle? Was he involved in that?
No, not at that point. It was considered the opening hostilities of the war. You're right there. That July, I think it was, just weeks after Bunker Hill, which was actually part of the siege of Boston. We get down to it, technically. Washington assumed command of the colonial forces, and they had surrounded the Boston garrison that was had been occupying that city. But you're correct. The war had begun in earnest with Bunker Hill, or Breed's Hill, as that was where most of the fighting actually occurred.
Yeah, so Breed's Hill is where that first battle actually occurred. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Well, the British had actually, as I alluded earlier, occupied Boston. I didn't realize this, but they'd been in Boston for about 7 years under a General Gage. And during that time, tensions had grown worse until the conflict erupted at Lexington and Concord. And Gage, who was in command of those troops in the colonies, had about 5,000, I think, troops under his command at that point in time. And shortly after, I think it was in May of that year, he got another 4,500 reinforcements, along with 3 generals, a William Howe, a Henry Clinton, and a General John Burgoyne. And that brought the total number of British troops to roughly 10,000. And these generals had been sent there to get Gage off his duff and into action. Gage had kind of settled in and become the governor of Massachusetts, but hadn't done much else. So that very next month, it turns out that spies for Washington, or really for the colonials, had determined that the British were planning a breakout, and they wanted to fortify the hills surrounding the city. And so they put a Colonel Prescott in command of about 1,200 militia and ordered him to set about building fortifications atop Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill, just north of the city, a high ground that commanded the heights of the city. Instead, Breed's Hill, which was just a little bit south of Bunker Hill, but also a bit closer to Boston, was for some reason chosen. And the fortifications went up there, and it was here that most of the combat took place a few months later. The battle was a victory for the British, actually, but they lost tremendous losses in dead and captured, far greater than the colonists. I think the Americans lost roughly 450 killed or wounded, and the British lost over 1,000. But most importantly, they lost almost 90 officers. And but interestingly, this loss is apparently what convinced them to hire large numbers of foreign mercenaries to shore up their strength in facing this, what turns out to be a fairly formidable Continental Army. And as you might suspect, this gave the Patriots a bit of confidence that they could go toe-to-toe with the British. So we've got a fight on our hands.
So Washington technically wasn't in command yet here, right?
No.
So when does he take command of the army?
Well, after the Battle of Bunker Hill, this siege of Boston that I'd mentioned earlier, it really turned into a stalemate. And as I said earlier, it was in June. Yes, June, that Washington was assigned CENS, the commander in chief. Then a month later, he arrives in the Boston area, actually in Cambridge, to take charge of the newly established army. And his immediate objective is to attack and drive out the British. But his staff isn't in sync with him, and they're not in agreement at all. So he defers. And you remember the name Henry Knox, perhaps, a bookseller.
Yeah.
Who becomes very influential, ultimately Washington's Secretary of War. But he had directed extremely effective cannon fire during the Battle of Bunker Hill. And this caught Washington's eye. And so as to do something, Washington put him in charge of an expedition to go back to Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point in upstate New York to bring back cannon, roughly 59 cannon that were left there. They'd been captured by the colonial forces under Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold earlier that year. And this trek's going to take Knox about 3 winter months by boat, horse, ox-drawn carts. They travel, I think, over 300 miles in ice and snow to get these cannons back to through New York to Boston and the siege camps.
Wow.
Yeah. Just previous to this, Congress had authorized, this will be interesting to you, they'd authorized a Major General Schuyler to invade the province of Quebec if he felt necessary. I didn't know this. Allen and Arnold actually had been a part of that force, and this occurred just prior to Washington being placed in overall command.
So we were attacking Canada? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's true. Remember, the British won the French and Indian War, and they had taken Quebec and Montreal in the process. But I didn't realize that the Continental Congress was concerned that the Brits apparently were going to launch an invasion from the north, out of Canada. Down the St. Lawrence River through Lake Champlain and on down the Hudson River right into New York. So the objective was to seize Quebec and Montreal from the Brits and then persuade those French-speaking Canadians to join the revolution on the side of the colonies. As an important, they hoped, of course, that France might be induced to join the colonies in their revolutionary efforts. So in late June, authorization for this invasion of Canada was issued. So
wow. Okay.
That's how we got there.
All right. Well, was Washington involved in that then?
Well, it takes a while, but Washington, he's been stymied. He wants to do something. So he knows the cannon are coming back to him. And when they do get there, he decides to propose an attack on Boston. But again, his officers are against it. Now, I would add that he's using a council of war with his officers. That's what he chose to do as commander in chief. Mm-hmm. So he submits to their will in this. But he's an offensive guy. He wants to fight. They urged him to wait until the waters around Boston were frozen, so the city couldn't be resupplied by ship. So frustrated, he decides to go into Canada. And so he sends Benedict Arnold's force to assist Schuyler in taking Quebec. So he's kind of stalled in Boston, but he's going to go into Canada. And remember, he's got Knox coming back from Ticonderoga with his artillery. So, so he decides to find another way to dislodge the British. And once the cannon arrive, he directs his men to take those cannon from Fort Ticonderoga up Dorchester Heights, which is a series of low but commanding hills, this time south of Boston. They overlook Boston and its harbor, but they're situated south, where Bunker Hill and Breeze Hill were north. And he accomplished this at night, stealthily.
Wow.
And the next morning, the British wake up to see a host of cannon emplacements pointed at them.
Yeah,
From
wow.
these heights. And the British fleet was now within range of these American guns. And so It's putting Howe now in imminent risk. Howe has taken over for Gage, and he's got the ground troops now, and he's prepared to send the troops up to Dorchester Heights to dislodge those guns, but a freak snowstorm prevents him from the assault. And so he's really in a trick. He's fearing a brutal bombardment, actually. So he decides just arbitrarily to leave Boston. He's been in the city now for almost, will be 8 years now. So he sends intermediaries to deliver an unsigned paper that informs Washington that he's going to leave the city, but he's going to burn it to the ground if his troops aren't allowed to leave unmolested. So Washington never answers this dispatch. And after several more days of bad weather, they do depart by sea, taking with them 1,000 loyalist civilians out of the city of Boston. And Washington marches into the city unopposed the following day. The British.
All right. We got to wrap it up here, Larry. Okay.
Yeah.
This sounds like a good point. He's now Washington's looking toward New York and New Jersey now.
The British have ended their military activities in New England, and Washington, who correctly feared that the British were going to attack New York City, he departed in April, I think, a month later, and he's headed for Manhattan and what would become the New York and the New Jersey campaign, which we'll cover in our next episode.
Okay, great. That'll be episode 3, part 3, segment 2 coming up. So thank you very much, Larry. Good job again.
Well, I look forward to it. I know we got a lot of minutia.
All right. Very interesting. Thanks a lot, Larry.
Oh, you bet. Always like to work with you, Dale.
Thank you.
Take care.
I'll tell you, Larry does an unbelievable job.
Yep. He really brings it to life, doesn't he?
He does. Mm-hmm. The way he digs into this, for him to go through all the founders like he plans on doing, we could be doing this for years, but that's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
He digs out details that certainly some of the I've never heard.
Okay, well, let's wrap it up here. Let's talk about what's coming up. This is kind of long, I know, but coming up on the 20th, next Monday, Debbie Stewart's going to come on and talk again about the Trump's 10-point education plan. I think she's got some specific things she wanted to talk about. We got something happening up in the Minnesota legislature, and I'm going to be meeting with the co-state directors for Minnesota to find out what that's all about. So hopefully we'll have something to present there. Of course, Minnesota's not a past state, so maybe there's something cooking up there that we could make them a past state. Going to be talking to another gentleman involved in the J6 pardon project. So hopefully I'm going to hope to have something for us to talk about with him coming up on the 20th. And we'll try our best to get in another COS basics from John Ackerman on the 20th. So things cooking for our next broadcast. And of course, then coming up on the 27th is our next roundtable and with John Ackerman, and we're going to be talking about the Trump 10-point plan to dismantle the administrative state. So this will be on the 27th. Trump will already be in office, and who knows, that may all be changed by the 27th.
A new arrangement to have to go through on the 27th for sure.
Yeah, could be all changed. Who knows? I tell you, I think things are going to break loose as soon as he takes office. I think it's going to be hard to keep up with everything. But anyway.
Yeah, it'll be interesting.
Ought to be exciting.
Yep.
We should have a lot to talk about and coming up here very soon. If anyone viewing tonight has any question or comment about our live stream, feel free to drop us an email at raiseyourvoicecos@gmail.com. raiseyourvoicecos@gmail.com. So that's how you get in touch with us, and we look forward to hearing from you. So, Ken, let's let Marengo Mike come on and close it out for us this evening. And Marengo is going to invite you to join Convention of States if you have any interest. So, Marengo Mike will tell you how to do that. And thank you all for tuning in this evening. We'll enjoy having you, and I hope you enjoyed our broadcast this evening and look forward to seeing everyone on the 20th. So, Ken, have a good evening.
You too. Sign the petition.
See you. Hey.
Marengo Mike here with a reminder that our work to raise the bar on making our federal government accountable to the people is only halfway done. We need to grow our grassroots army of citizens every day to fulfill the vision of our forefathers and keep our land free and prosperous. So, if you have never signed the petition to show your support, use that QR code and do that now. While you're there, why not kick it up a notch and volunteer for many of the positions available where your talents can make a difference as we march into a new year. Thank you, and God bless.